Tim, I've been obsessed with consciousness my whole professional career. What is this inner sense of awareness that we have? And I always look for ways to approach it. And it seems like the question of free will, which is a deep philosophical question, is a probe, is a way we can get in underneath consciousness. How do you see that?
I think there are two windows between free will and consciousness, and they're narrow windows, and they're opaque. I don't think there's any clear, wide open French transparent window between the two, but here are the lines as I see them, the connection between the two. One thing we think consciousness does for us is it integrates information and integrates capacities. And that's what we think free will is also about in some fashion or another. It's about having the ability to behave in a complex and a kind of plastic way to your environment. We have beliefs about the kind of person that we are and want to be. We have information coming in from the world. We have all sorts of emotional states, some of which we've endorsed and some of which we haven't. We've got all this limbic activity to deal with, which we've inherited from many millennia of evolution, and we might not really want it, but we've got it. Now, we could let various subsystems just run off and generate their own behavior. I mean, to take a caricature, we could have been set up so that what we did with our hands was generated by visual information, what we did with our feet was generated by auditory information. But that's not how we are, and that kind of creature would not have anything that we would recognize as free will. We're the kind of creatures that are able to integrate this limbic these emotions that we feel, rage, jealousy, sadness, with what we think we ought to think about a situation. We can reflect, we can take a step back from our immediate emotional response and say, well, I feel like that, but I shouldn't. Those feelings are unwarranted. Mm-hmm. And that involves integration, involves integrating various bits of information, involves integration of various systems. And once you're talking about that kind of integration, you're in the realm of free will. The other thing which I would say, which is very closely connected with that, is we think free will is something that selves have, persons have. So it's me who acts freely or acts intentionally, acts voluntarily. It's I'm responsible for my actions. So if I have an anarchic hand, if I've suffered from a brain lesion and I have anarchic hand syndrome and my hand... Which means that my hand, usually the left hand, will engage in kind of automatic behavior. And if I'm at a restaurant, as sometimes happens to these patients, and you're at the table next to me, my hand might reach over and grab some of your food, right? I see the food. Mm-hmm. Food generates... If it's good food, if we're at a nice restaurant, food generates the desire for it. And the inhibition mechanisms, I'm in a restaurant, I don't know you very well, it's an inappropriate thing to do. I can control my right hand, so I'm not going to do that with my right hand, but my left hand will do it. Yeah. But we say of that situation, well, there's a sense in which that person took the food from their neighbor's plate, but we don't really think that was an action of the person. It was their hand, we might say, that did it, or some system that's out of control. Now, if consciousness is in the business of integrating systems, then that gives us a self, a single entity to whom we can ascribe responsibility, as opposed to a bunch of separate modules, subsystems that are just doing their own thing.
So that's the challenge. You need a self, an integrated person, for free will. That's right. Almost by definition.
Yep.
But on the consciousness side, it's not by definition, because that's the controversy, right. Whether consciousness is indeed unified, which you believe, or as many neuroscientists say, it's just a combination of subsystems that give us the illusion of integration, which is not real.
So what I would say is, it is a combination of subsystems, and maybe there's a sense in which it generates an illusion. But illusions, if they're believed by the user of that illusion, then they take on their own reality. Mm-hmm. And it's not a completely baseless reality, insofar as I can control this subsystem. There are mechanisms, there are subsystems of oversight, of control. There's enough integration that a supersystem emerges. I mean, countries are in some sense collections of subsystems, but if they're integrated, if they're not at civil war, if they haven't deconstructed themselves, they haven't fallen apart, then you can talk about the country, and you can say that U.S. foreign policy is this, U.S. trade policy is that.
Okay, but the benefit of free will here is that you have this strong sense of needing a self, an integrated personality.
Yeah.
And so does that help us be more confident that consciousness itself is integrated? Because we know for sure that free will is dependent upon consciousness, and so does that reflect on consciousness itself? It's not a logical argument, but is it a suggestive one?
It's a suggestive one. I mean, I myself am partial to the suggestion. But you can play that game both ways, can't you? I mean, the way you phrase that question.
Sure.
You can start by saying, we know that we have free will. We know that free will demands a certain kind of unity, therefore there has to be that unity.
Right.
Or you can say, look, it's up for grabs whether we have that kind of free will, and therefore it's up for grabs whether we've got the kind of unity that that kind of free will would need.
Yeah, and somebody could go the opposite way and say, we know for sure consciousness is disunified, and we know free will is a product of, so maybe we have to downgrade the free will to account for consciousness.
Yeah.
You could do the causation in both ways.
You certainly could. Yeah.
But the point, I think, is that in order to deal with either one, you have to deal with both.
I think that is an important point. You certainly, the connections between agency, and free will is part of that, but agency is a multifaceted, multi-headed beast. We're agents in many ways, in many different kinds of contexts. You've got to deal with agency if you're dealing with consciousness and vice versa. I mean, we're beings that act and we're beings that sense. And evolution and the development of the species, the development of the individual is responsive both to action and subjectivity and perception. You can't look at these things in isolation from each other.